So Goal 13 is taking urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. I think it's the only goal with an asterisk, which is an acknowledgement that the UNFCCC is the primary international intergovernmental forum for negotiating the global response to climate change. I mean, this is recognition that the best and most urgent action we can take is to agree an ambitious and legally binding agreement in Paris in December of this year. And an awful lot of effort in all countries is going into those negotiations, which are starting to hopefully gather more pace as we approach December. So I mean, some of the key issues we're looking at there are that they will be applicable to all. We're looking for a 2 degree reference. We need to keep temperatures well below 2 degrees, and there will be some pushing for 1.5, we know that. And we know that the INDCs, the commitments that have been put forward together, the proposed commitments, are at the moment totalling up to something closer to a 3 degree increase in global average temperatures. So it will be crucial that anything we agree in Paris does deliver some sort of a review mechanism or a global stocktake that allows us to improve over time. And again, strong sort of transparency and accountability mechanisms to make sure we can track our progress and that we can make sure that we're implementing what we've agreed. Of course, the EU has already put forward its intended contribution, which is the at least 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 on 1990 levels. So I mean, what we're interested in is really a very strong signal in Paris. So the goals that have been agreed in New York are slightly different, but what they do have in common is that these are things that all countries can do, and I know other speakers have already spoken about that. These targets are things that all parties can do, all countries can take action on. So strengthening resilience and adaptive capacity, integrating climate change measures into all national policies and planning, and improving education and awareness raising and building capacity for climate action. And these are supported by 2 targets on means of implementation. The first being the $100 billion goal by 2020. This was a 2009 agreement entered into by developed country parties to the UNFCCC, including Ireland, to address the needs of developing countries. And then the Green Climate Fund is one part of that funding mechanism. And then the second thing is to promote mechanisms for building capacity, particularly in least developed countries and small island states. So, as mentioned, I think by others, this is a 15-year programme, so we have quite a lot to do. By that stage, we would have sort of one full cycle. If we agree a 5-year or a 10-year commitment period under the new agreement, we'd have one complete by 2030, or we'd have 2 5-year reviews already implemented through the Paris Protocol when we get it. So we're just beginning, but what I wanted to do was sort of give a view of where we are at the moment and what's happening, because there is quite a lot happening. In terms of adaptation and strengthening resilience, what's being done in Ireland so far? So in 2012, most of you will be aware, we had the National Adaptation Framework, which sort of set an overall context for adaptation planning in Ireland. And that's now supported by a national steering group on adaptation, which is made up of relevant government departments and agencies. And those are working to prepare sectoral adaptation plans and inputs. So the statutory, there will be statutory obligations under the bill once that's passed, but this work is already underway to try to build institutional capacity and also raise awareness through the various structures of government. We also have the EU National Preparedness Scoreboard, which allows us to sort of benchmark where we are in comparison to other EU member states. And I mean, nobody is really pulling very far ahead. I mean, all member states are learning, and it's an ongoing process. So it is something that we need to keep an eye on to make sure that we are working towards the top end of that. And then, of course, there's a lot of research happening through the EPA in particular. I think somebody mentioned to me that was the best side of things at the moment. There's a lot of work being done on climate modelling and projected impacts and adaptation options. So, I mean, under the bill, we would have a new adaptation framework within 24 months of enactment. And things like emergency planning will be integrated into all of those sectoral plans. And then again, I mean, an awful lot of the work we do through Irish Aid on the international side is also focused on adaptation, but I will come back to that shortly. So Integrating climate change measures into national policy, strategies and planning. This is really an area where an awful lot of work has been done in the last few years, and the bill is just one further step in that. So we have our national policy position, which sets out a national context and a national long-term transition objective for a low-carbon economy and society by 2050, and that's accompanied by these long-term objectives of an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions across the electricity, built environment and transport sectors, and a vision of carbon neutrality in the agriculture sector. And it was good to see that we got some recognition of that in the capital plan. So the national policy position is referenced. 2 minutes, okay, I'll speed up. The bill will provide for sector-specific action. So this is partly integration, and it's partly also building capacity and communication. Policy coherence structures have been put in place. There's a cabinet committee on economic infrastructure and climate change, so it's really good to have those two things together being looked at in the same structure. We have a senior officials group. We have a new group on technical research and modelling, which is aiming to build capacity of modelling in the government system, in the policy system. And then again, climate change is a priority of our international development policy, One World, One Future. So improving education, awareness raising and capacity on climate change across all the issues. This is an area where more needs to be done. I think we can all acknowledge that. The mitigation and adaptation steering groups are one way that's already happening, and building in sort of sectoral engagement. It's not just the Department of the Environment issue. This is the Department of Transport, the Department of Energy, the Department of Agriculture, and everybody needs to be looking at their sectors. We have 2 public consultations, either already out or about to go on, one on the ETS and one on the Strategic Environmental Assessment Scoping Report on the National Mitigation Plan. There are links on the website for that. Tidy Towns, this was the first year there was a climate change prize there, which does help to raise awareness in local communities. We have ongoing engagement through Green Schools, which I know Natasha are also involved in. And then there's a logo competition for school children to design the logo of the new Climate Change Advisory Council, which is about to be announced any day. And then internationally, Irish Aid are very involved in developing a learning programme to integrate risk management and climate adaptation into our development policies. So this is the one on finance and the means of implementation. So, I mean, Ireland has, through very difficult economic circumstances and continuing difficult circumstances, maintained our climate-related ODA flows at around 34 million a year. We know there are significant limits on public expenditure still, but we have engaged in quite a lot of interdepartmental work to develop a whole-of-government approach, and we are looking at all the options available to us for scaling up that support to developing countries, including through the Green Climate Fund. And finally, in terms of promoting capacity building in LDCs and SIDS, as I mentioned, Irish Aid have been very engaged in this. They've developed this climate change and development learning platform. It provides capacity building support for LDCs, but also provides support for them in the negotiations at the UNFCCC to make sure that the new global agreement takes due account of LDCs and SID positions. So,
Thanks.
sorry, thank you.
I will, of course, speak about climate, but as Hans mentioned, I was in New York on the Irish delegation, and I want to just share just a few reflections on that. I've been at this malarkey for 20 years now, 10 years in the overseas aid and global development industry, and 10 years in Friends of the Earth. So I've seen both aspects of the sustainability, international sustainability debate. And as Hans mentioned, I'm not entirely cynical. I'm not a hardened cynic, but you can't help but be occasionally sceptical, shall we say. But as Hans mentioned, sometimes the UN works. And Friday was one of those days. It was a very uplifting day to see the 193 governments, 154 world leaders there themselves to adopt these goals. And if you do one thing, I would say read the preamble. It's not much more than a page. It's in plain English, written mostly by an Irishman, adopted by everybody. And yes, it's mostly motherhood and apple pie. It's people, planet, prosperity, peace, partnership. But it's good. I'd live in that world if we achieved it in the next 15 years. If NGOs sat down, if we in this room spent the day writing a page about what kind of world we want to see in 2030, it wouldn't look that different to that page. And right now, all our leaders have signed up to it. And that is not insignificant. Interestingly, given that there are 17 goals and 169 targets, as they try to summarise it, not in the preamble, but in the communications around it, first of all, thank God, they started talking about the global goals for sustainable development rather than the SDGs, because nobody knows what the SDGs are. No one will ever know what the SDGs are. Nobody likes three-letter acronyms. Please, 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 let's talk about the global goals for sustainable development. We have a chance of people on the street understanding us. But they started talking about ending poverty, inequality, and climate change. So despite the fact that actually environmentalists are climate change activists, and there's an asterisk that says climate change is done somewhere else, actually when it came to it in the communications, climate change is quite central to it. So we can certainly use that. There are, of course, contradictions in the goals. It's not all good news. There's a significant contradiction between, on the one hand, sustainability, climate change, biodiversity, on the other hand, ongoing, endless economic growth that is seen by many as in that room as the engine for everything else. So that contradiction remains, and if anything, is as bad as ever. On the other hand, it's some of the strongest language the UN has ever adopted on sustainable consumption and production, which is their code for overconsumption. So there's really good stuff there that we can use. I think it's really good too that this is called Agenda 2030 as well for sustainable development, because many of us are old enough to remember Rio and Agenda 21. But if you go into a government ministry now and say, you should be doing more about Agenda 21, they'd look at you like you've got two heads. They have no idea what you're saying. It's a very long time ago. It's become, in a sense, degraded by neglect. Well, right now, they all signed up 4 days ago for something that encompasses all of that agenda and brings together very, very well environmental, social, and economic, the three pillars of sustainability. So there's an awful lot for us to work with in this. Having said that, I have to say, I've said it publicly, so I'm not saying it anything new. I thought our Taoiseach was very disappointing in New York. His speech was exclusively in the overseas aid and overseas development paradigm, despite the fact Ireland was central to negotiating the goals and knew damn well what they're about. There was absolutely no recognition, no reference to these goals applying to Ireland. Whereas when Obama took the stage, he said there are unpublished people not far from this building to whom these goals apply, and that he committed his country to working to achieving those goals. He also spoke, Obama did, centrally about climate change as one of the greatest threats to achieving the goals. Our Taoiseach didn't mention climate change once in his speech. Now, he didn't get as much time as Obama, but he didn't mention it once. It's only a year since in those same halls he spoke about needing courage, conviction, clarity, certainty around climate change. It's the only good speech he's ever given about climate change. This year he made no reference to it. And I think that reflects on the poverty of imagination inside our government with regard to climate change. But not with our officials. I'd say, I'm going to be critical and then I'm going to finish, about Irish government policy and climate change, but not critical of the work that Petra and John are doing, both internationally and domestically. I got a pass from having to sit through the debate in the Dáil this morning to come here, but poor John had to sit beside the ministers and wade through the amendments. But finally we're getting the climate change bill. And Petra does very good work at international level and is very much respected among the NGOs and the other governments. But Irish climate change policy is hopeless. We know what policy looks like when a government is serious. It looks like the Action Plan for Jobs. It looks like fiscal policy under the Troika. It looks like Foodwise 2025. Climate policy is nowhere near that level of action. It's taken 4 years for this government, and I emphasise my criticism is at the political level, 4 years for this government to produce a climate bill that's much the same as the one that was produced by the last government, except the targets are taken out. We're going to go through this whole 5-year period without an action plan. So the one thing, people who criticise the bill, and there are many, say, what use is it? And I say, well, the one thing it'll achieve is the next government can't go through 5 years without producing an action plan on climate change, which this government's going to do, because the bill will make it a legal requirement for that. And it'll achieve a number of other things. But we are not taking it seriously. We're not acting on it. I think energy policy can help fill the gap to some degree, but essentially Irish government has been focused on looking to get agriculture off the hook at the European level and at the international level, and not looking to lead on Ireland beginning to make the transition to a low carbon economy. We can talk much more at length about what that looks like, what it should look like, and what is actually happening in the workshop if you want to join us. I'll make one final comment in the 30 seconds I've left about where we go from here on the goals as a whole. The Taoiseach promised a debate in the Dáil before New York, and of course that didn't happen. But actually I think it might be more appropriate to have it now, afterwards, because there's a bit more awareness about them given the summit's happened. But it can only be the start of something. We need to have a more public debate that this helps happen. We need to have probably Oireachtas committee hearings. We need NESC to be involved as well at the national level, and there are others on that council who are in that civil society coalition with the environmental pillar and DOCUS. We probably need the Department of the Taoiseach to be the ones who lead the process, because at the moment responsibility for the framework for sustainable development in Ireland rests with the Department of Environment, and they can't get the other departments to take it seriously, much like climate change policy. It probably needs to sit with government. It's going to take us a couple of years perhaps. This is a 15-year process to come together with an inclusive whole of government and whole of society owned programme to achieve this. Maybe not take this long, but in 1916 we have one centenary, 1918 will be the centenary of the elections, and 1919 the first Dáil. The first Dáil published a very, very radical document called the Democratic Programme, which of course was never implemented. It would be a good time if by then we had a whole of government, whole of society owned action plan for 2030 on this agenda, and then we have a really true legacy and really true achievement to mark our 100th anniversary as a state.